The colonization of North America attempted to assimilate Aboriginal peoples into settlers' European ways of living. Settler policies and attitudes meant that Aboriginal peoples were cut off from their traditional cultures, languages, spirituality, economies, systems of governance, and other important parts of their identity. Research shows that the consequences of trauma are not limited to the person immediately exposed to the traumatic event. However, intergenerational trauma is any trauma, including historical oppression, that has an impact across more than one generation. This impact includes shared collective memories that affect the health and well-being of individuals and communities, and they may be passed on from parent to child and beyond. The traditional ways of living that fostered resiliency in indigenous communities were almost completely abolished by colonialism. Not only did acts of colonialism cause trauma in indigenous people, but it also affected their means of coping with and healing from trauma. This is why historical trauma is so enduring and continues to negatively affect generation after generation of indigenous people today. Some of the effects of historical trauma are depression and mental illness, sometimes leading to suicide, feelings of hopelessness, addiction as a result of coping by drinking or doing drugs, substance abuse, and sexual and physical abuse, including domestic violence. The Indian residential school system is one of the better-known examples of an intergenerational colonial system with impacts that will reverberate today. The schools were designed primarily to re-educate Aboriginal children to conform to the colonizers' world. Children were taken away from their families and forced to live in unfamiliar, hostile environments where beatings and other forms of ill treatment were the norm. At the height of this practice, more than 100 residential schools were in operation across the country, attended by some 100,000 Aboriginal children. Children's pain of being away from family was often worsened by disease, hunger, physical, and sexual abuse. This attempt to strip Indigenous children of their culture and language lasted for generations, with the last residential school closing in 1996. Many former students are alive today and are living with the effects of the trauma they endured at the schools. Moreover, residential schools had impacts on the physical and social health of children who attended them, and on the generations that followed. These impacts have included medical conditions, mental health issues, post-traumatic stress disorder, changes to spiritual practices, loss of language and traditional knowledge, violence, suicide, and effects on gender roles in childbearing and family relationships. As residential schools began closing their doors, provincial and territorial systems of child welfare emerged. The 60s scoop continued the residential school tradition of taking Aboriginal children from their families, but instead placed them in foster homes or on adoption lists. The stark overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and families in the child welfare system continues today. In 2015, more than 50% of youth in care in British Columbia were Aboriginal. There are similar overrepresentations of Aboriginal peoples reflected in statistics concerning the correction system, the education system, employment and health, and poverty and homelessness rates. When those children who had survived the residential schools returned to the communities, the impact of their experiences on attachment and family dynamics were profound. Many survivors report that not only did they return to the communities with a high degree of trauma, but they had few resources to help them cope with their experiences. They had missed out on learning their own cultural ways of coping and practicing good health, wellness, and parenting. Many survivors were later targeted by the child welfare system for conditions of poverty and neglect that were a direct result of their experiences in these institutions. A great many children from successive generations were taken from the family home and placed in the child welfare system. Many of the abuses and racist discourses that underpinned the Indian residential school system continued within the child welfare system. Although the process of colonization had a big impact in Indigenous people in Canada, we can see the possibilities for reconciliation and restorative practices that shift relationships. Intergenerational trauma brings to light the ways that resilience, adaptation, and innovation are shared across generation. Restorative practices and approaches, whether they are used in the context of social work, education, healthcare, or elsewhere,